I can find another wife. He said it the way a man orders a new pair of boots, without blinking, without feeling, without understanding what he was throwing away. Clara Aldridge Remington did not cry, she did not beg. She removed her wedding ring, set it beside his untouched supper, and walked out the door before Arthur Remington could finish his next sentence. 7 years of silence finally had its answer. If you have ever loved someone who treated you like a replacement part, stay with us. Subscribe to this channel and drop your city in the comment. This story is for every woman who finally chose herself. The letter had taken Clara 3 hours to write, not because the words were difficult. Clara Aldridge Remington had never struggled with words. She had learned Latin at 11, correspondence at 13, and estate accounting by the time most girls her age were embroidering handkerchiefs in parlor rooms. No, the letter took 3 hours because she had written it 5 times, and each time she reached the final paragraph, she stopped and started again. She wanted it to be right. She always wanted things to be right. That was the problem, though she did not know it yet. The fire in the study hearth had burned low by the time she sealed the envelope with the Remington wax stamp, her husband's stamp, pressed into red wax with the same steady hand she used for everything in that house. The date was March the 4th, 1814. Outside the tall windows of Remington Hall, the Virginia Piedmont lay still under the last cold breath of winter, and the tobacco fields were dark and quiet, waiting for the season to turn. Clara carried the letter into the dining room herself. She could have sent Margaret the housekeeper. She could have left it on the silver tray by the front staircase where Arthur collected his correspondence each morning. But she had decided she would hand it to him directly, because the contents of that letter were not ordinary business, and they deserved to be given with her own 2 hands. Arthur was at the head of the table. He had not touched his supper. The roasted pheasant sat cooling on its platter. The bread had gone stiff, and his wineglass was nearly empty, refilled once already by Thomas, the houseboy, who had learned long ago not to speak unless spoken to when Mr. Remington wore that particular expression. Arthur wore it now. He was reading a document. Not the document Clara had sent him 3 days ago regarding the Harwell account. Not the summary she had prepared for the spring lease negotiations. Something else, folded, official, bearing the seal of a law office out of Richmond. Clara set the letter down beside his plate. "I've written to James Whitfield," she said quietly. "He is willing to extend the credit line through harvest if we demonstrate solvency by May. I've outlined the steps we need to take. It's all in there." Arthur did not look up. She waited. He turned a page of his document. "Arthur, I heard you. Then you might acknowledge." "I said I heard you, Clara." He set down the Richmond document and picked up his wineglass. "Whitfield is not the concern. The concern is Morrison and the Eastern Boundary dispute. You wouldn't know about it." Clara kept her voice steady. "I know about it. You received Morrison's letter on Tuesday. I drafted a response for you, which I did not send." "Which you did not send," she agreed. "May I ask why?" Arthur finally looked at her. He had a handsome face she had always thought, so strong-jawed, dark eyes, the kind of authority in his bearing that men spent decades cultivating and Arthur Remington had simply been born with. He looked at her the way he looked at ledgers that didn't balance. Searching for the error. Certain it was there. "Because the response you drafted was too conciliatory," he said. "Morrison is attempting to steal 40 acres of the best creek bottom land on this property. A conciliatory letter invites him to try harder. A conciliatory letter keeps him out of court," Clara replied. "And keeps us out of the expense of a Richmond attorney, which we cannot afford right now." "We can afford whatever I decide we can afford." She looked at him for a long moment. There was something she might have said then. Something true and sharp and overdue. But she pressed it down. The way she had pressed down 100 things before it. And she folded her hands in front of her and said instead, "Will you read the Whitfield letter tonight?" "Perhaps. The situation is more urgent than Clara." His voice had that edge now, the one that meant the conversation was finished whether she had finished speaking or not. "I have been managing this estate since before you came into this house. I am capable of handling James Whitfield." She said nothing. He picked up his fork, looked at the cold pheasant and set it down again. "Send Thomas for something hot." Clara walked to the doorway and spoke to the boy waiting in the hall. When she turned back, Arthur was reading the Richmond document again. She stood there for a moment, just a moment, watching him. The fire in the wall sconce threw a warm light across the dining room. The portrait of Arthur's father hung above the sideboard, severe and confident, very like his son. The whole room smelled of beeswax candles and cold roast, and the faint pipe smoke that had soaked into the curtains over years and years. She had loved this house, she still did. She turned and went upstairs to bed, and Arthur did not say good night, and neither did she. It was 3 days later when it happened. The morning had been difficult from the start. The foreman, old Cassius Webb, had come to the back door before breakfast with news that 2 of the tenant laborers from the Hendricks family had not reported to the tobacco barn, and Mrs. Hendricks herself had sent her eldest boy to explain that her husband had taken a fall and broken his arm, and 3 of her children were sick with fever. Clara listened to all of it, thanked young Hendricks for coming, and sent him home with a basket of preserved food and a promise that she would speak to Dr. Alcott that afternoon. Then she went to Arthur. He was in the front parlor with 2 men Clara recognized as land agents from Culpeper County. A deal was being discussed, she could tell from the maps, spread across the low table, weighted at the corners with Arthur's silver inkwell and a copy of Virginia's land survey codes. She waited in the doorway until Arthur glanced up. The Hendricks family, she said. John Hendricks has broken his arm. 3 of the children are ill. Will later, Clara. Arthur, the tobacco seedlings need attention by the week's end. If the Hendricks plot goes untended, I said later. His eyes went back to the map. Gentlemen, if you'll direct your attention to the northern boundary here. Clara stepped into the room. Both land agents turned to look at her with the mild curiosity men wore when a woman appeared where they hadn't expected one. I apologize for the interruption, she said to them, pleasantly, without apology in her voice. Mr. Remington, I need 2 minutes. The decision cannot wait. Something crossed Arthur's face, displeasure at being challenged in front of business associates. She knew that look well, but he excused himself with a word and followed her into the hallway. That was embarrassing, he said, low and clipped. I know, I'm sorry. She kept moving into the small sitting room off the hall so they would not be overheard. The Hendricks is 12 acres of the best seedling beds. If it goes untended this week, we lose the early crop. That's 3 months of tobacco revenue. Arthur crossed his arms. Tell Webb to reassign. I ordered him. He's short-handed. He lost 2 men to the green farm last month when you declined to raise wages. A beat of silence. I declined to raise wages because you didn't think it necessary, I understand. But the consequence of that decision is standing in front of you right now. She kept her voice even. I can have the problem solved by Thursday if you authorize me to hire 2 temporary hands from the town labor exchange. It will cost us $11, Arthur said nothing. Arthur. $11 to protect 3 months of revenue. The word was bitten off. Fine, do it. Thank you. She moved to pass him, and he didn't step aside quite fast enough, and for one moment they were very close in the narrow hallway. And Clara thought she felt something shift in the space between them, something old and familiar, something that remembered another time. But he stepped back and she walked on. That evening at supper, she made the mistake of mentioning the Morrison boundary dispute again. She had not intended to reopen the argument. But she had spent the afternoon going over the survey records, and she had found something in 1801 notation in the county register that placed the true boundary of the Remington land, a full 60 feet east of where Morrison was claiming. It was the kind of detail that could end the dispute cleanly, without litigation, without cost. She brought it to the table with the survey book itself. I found the original registry entry, she began. If you send this to Morrison directly, not through an attorney, just the page reference, it ends the dispute on its face. He cannot argue with the county register. Arthur looked at the book, then at her. Where did you find this? In the estate archive. The tin box in the study, the one on the lower shelf. That archive is not your concern. She blinked. I was trying to help resolve the... I did not ask for your help resolving it. Clara set the survey book down on the table. Carefully, deliberately. You are having a dispute that threatens 40 acres of this estate, she said. I found the document that could resolve it cleanly. I don't understand what the difficulty is. The difficulty, Arthur said, and his voice had gone very quiet in the way that should have warned her, is that you seem to believe this estate runs on your opinion. No. Her voice was just as quiet. I believe it runs on careful management, which I have provided for 7 years, which is your duty as my wife. She looked at him. Something inside her went very still. My duty, she repeated. He picked up his wine. I did not marry you to argue estate matters over supper, Clara. I married you to manage this household. There is a difference. And what? She asked slowly. Is the difference exactly? Arthur set down his glass. The difference is that this estate, and every decision made regarding it, belongs to me. Not to you. Assist you do not govern. She was quiet for a long time. The fire popped. Somewhere outside a night bird called once and went silent. I see, Clara said. I'm glad we understand each other. She picked up the survey book. She was going to say something else. She could feel the words, hard and precise, pressing against the inside of her teeth. But she looked at his face, and she saw that he was already returning to his meal, already done with the conversation, already certain it was finished. And she said nothing. She carried the survey book back to the study and set it on the desk. And she sat down in the chair beside the cold fireplace. And she pressed her palms flat against the top of her thighs. And she breathed. She thought about the letter she had written to James Whitfield. She thought about the Hendricks family, warm now in their cottage with the food she had sent. She thought about the boundary dispute that she had just solved, with a document Arthur would now use without ever once saying her name. She thought about 7 years, and she sat very still in the dark study for a long time. The final evening came 6 days later. Clara had discovered the Harwell matter that morning, not the routine credit extension she had already written to Whitfield about, but something older and considerably worse. A second mortgage on the North Pasture, signed in 1809, the year before she and Arthur married. A debt she had known nothing about, a debt that was now 2 payment cycles in arrears. She had gone through the numbers 3 times. Then she had gone through Arthur's locked correspondence box, which she had no authority to open and which she opened anyway, using the small key she had found years ago at the back of his writing desk drawer and had quietly kept, because she had learned that in this house, information arrived to her late or not at all. What she found in that box was worse than the mortgage. There were letters from a Richmond broker. Speculative investments, 3 of them, made in 1000, 812 and 1813. During 2 of the worst harvest years the Piedmont had suffered. The investments had failed. The losses were staggering, $40,000 roughly across the 3 ventures. $40,000 that Arthur had never mentioned. Not to her. Not to the Whitfield Bank. Not to anyone as far as she could tell. The estate was not merely stretched. The estate was in serious danger. And Arthur had let her spend 7 years managing the household accounts, cutting costs, writing careful letters to creditors, negotiating carefully for extensions, while never once telling her the true scale of what they were managing against. She carried the letters to the dining room that evening. Arthur was already at the table. He had poured his wine. He had the easy, settled look of a man who has finished a satisfactory day and expects a satisfactory supper. Clara set the letters on the table in front of him without speaking. He looked at them. Then he looked at her. Where did you get those? Not a question, a statement, flat and dangerous. From your correspondence box. That box is locked. Yes, she sat down across from him. I've known where the key is for 4 years. Arthur's jaw tightened. He picked up the letters, looked at them for a moment, and set them down again. These are business matters, he said. They are not yours. If you say they are not my concern. Clara said, very quietly, I will ask you to stop. He stopped. She looked at him across the table. The candlelight was warm and steady between them. I have spent 7 years managing this estate, she said. 7 years keeping these household accounts to the penny, so that there would be money to spare when it was needed. 7 years writing letters, negotiating terms, keeping the peace with your tenants and your creditors and your neighbors. All of that time I believed we were managing a household that was difficult but sound. You allowed me to believe that. Arthur said nothing. We are not, she continued. We are deeply compromised. The North Pasture mortgage is 2 payments behind. The investment losses from Richmond are not recorded anywhere in the household ledgers because you never told me about them. And if James Whitfield calls the credit line before harvest, we will not have the liquid assets to answer. I can fix this, she said. I believe I can fix this. The Whitfield letter I wrote lays the groundwork. But I need to know everything, every debt, every obligation, every note that is outstanding. Because I cannot manage what I am not permitted to know. Arthur looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, You went through my private correspondence. Clara stared at him. That is your response. You had no right. I had every right. Her voice did not rise, but something in it changed. Something that had been carefully soft for a very long time was gone now, and what was underneath was harder and cleaner. I am the one who has been managing this house. I am the one the creditors call when you are unavailable. I am the one who has been working with incomplete information for 7 years because you decided I didn't need to know the full picture of my own home. Your own home. Arthur's voice had an edge in it now, something she recognized and something she didn't. This estate is mine, Clara. My family built it. I know whose family built it, she said. I know whose name is on the deed. I also know whose letters kept the Whitfield Bank from calling the note in 1812, and whose negotiations with the Hanover County creditors gave you time to recover from the first bad harvest. I know all of that. Do you? Arthur set down his wineglass. You are becoming very difficult. I am becoming honest, she said. There is a difference. He looked at her with an expression she had not seen before. Not anger exactly, something closer to discomfort, the look of a man who has been handed a mirror he did not ask for. I will manage the Richmond matter. He said, I have already written to... You have written to no one, she said. I checked the outgoing correspondence. There has been nothing to Richmond since October. Arthur's face darkened. Clara. His voice was low. I am asking you for the last time to trust that I am capable of managing this estate. I do not doubt your capability, she said. I am questioning your willingness to let me help you. I do not need your help, Arthur. She leaned forward slightly. You need my help very much. The words sat between them in the candlelit room. Arthur looked at her for a long moment. Something moved across his face, something that might have been acknowledgement, or might have been the last wall going up. He chose the wall. I can find another wife, he said. He said it calmly, almost casually. The way a man mentions replacing a tenant who has become too complicated. The way a man exercises the one authority he has never had occasion to question. Clara went still, not the stillness of pain. The stillness of a woman who has just heard something she already knew and has finally stopped pretending she didn't. She looked at him. He was watching her with that measuring expression, waiting. She understood now, for her to fracture. To apologize, to retreat back into the softness that had always made the problem go away before. She picked up the letter she had placed beside his plate. The letter to James Whitfield, 3 hours of careful work, the document that might yet save the North pasture. She folded it, set it on the table. She looked down at her left hand, at the gold ring Arthur had placed on her finger 7 years ago in the parlor of her father's house, in front of 40 guests, in a ceremony that had felt like the beginning of something. She removed it, set it beside the folded letter. Arthur's expression shifted. For the first time that evening, something like uncertainty moved through his eyes. Claire, she pushed back her chair. Where are you going? The certainty in his voice had cracked just slightly at the edges. She looked at him. Somewhere I am not treated as something replaceable. She walked toward the door. Clara. He said her name differently this time. Not as a command, as something that was beginning to understand it was losing its grip. I didn't mean it as, but she was already through the door. The hallway was cool and dim, the house settling into its evening quiet around her. She did not pause at the base of the stairs, she did not go up. She went to the back of the house, to the small room off the kitchen where her personal trunk had lived since she arrived. Because she had always believed, on some level she had never examined, that she might one day need to leave quickly. Margaret was in the kitchen, tidying the last of the supper preparation. The old woman looked up when Clara came through the door, and something in Clara's face made Margaret go perfectly still. Ma'am? I need Thomas to bring the smaller carriage around, Clara said. Not the main drive, the back lane. Margaret looked at her for a long moment. Then she set down the cloth in her hands. Yes, ma'am, she said. I'll see to it. Clara went to her room and opened the trunk. She did not take much, a change of clothes. The small leather case where she kept her personal correspondence, her father's letters, her own copies of estate documents she had quietly made over the years, the ones that documented her work in her own hand. Her mother's brooch, the small amount of household funds she was owed and had never collected. She was packed in 12 minutes. She came back through the kitchen with the trunk handle in her hand, and Margaret was standing by the back door. Without a word, the older woman took the other handle, and together they carried it out to the back lane where Thomas was waiting with the carriage. His face carefully blank in the way of someone who has understood everything and will say nothing about it. Clara climbed up. She looked back once at the house. The candlelight in the dining room windows. The shape of Arthur standing at the window, she could see him there, see the line of his shoulders, see him watching. She had spent 7 years keeping that house in motion. 7 years making it work. She had done it with patience and intelligence and a willingness to remain invisible, when remaining invisible was what the estate needed. She was done being invisible. Thomas clicked to the horse. The carriage moved down the dark lane toward the road. And for the first time in 7 years, Clara Aldridge Remington, who had always been the one to stay, who had always been the one to repair, who had always been the one to make things work, sat back against the carriage seat and felt the cool night air on her face. She did not cry. There was nothing left in her to spend on crying. There was only the road ahead, and the dark fields on either side, and somewhere beyond them, a life she had forgotten she was allowed to want. She rode into it without looking back. The carriage had been gone for less than an hour when Arthur Remington did something he had not done in years. He poured himself a second glass of wine and did not drink it. He stood at the dining room window instead, the glass in his hand, looking out at the back lane where the wheel tracks were still pressed into the soft March mud. The candles behind him threw his shadow long across the floor. The pheasant had gone completely cold. The letter Clara had folded and left beside his plate sat exactly where she had placed it, and he had not touched it. He was not a man who panicked. He had inherited that from his father, a capacity for stillness in a crisis, a refusal to let urgency cloud judgment. It had served him well in business, in negotiation, in the kind of careful, calculated maneuvering that had kept Remington Estate solvent through 2 bad harvests and a war that had strangled half the Atlantic trade. But the stillness that settled over the dining room that night was a different kind entirely. He set the wine down. He picked up the folded letter. He read it. By the time he reached the 3rd paragraph where Clara had outlined, in precise and careful language, a plan that would restructure the Whitfield credit line, protect the North pasture, and buy the estate 8 months of breathing room, he had to stop and read it again. It was good. It was very good. It was, in fact, better than anything he had managed to produce in 2 months of worrying about the same problem in private. He set the letter down. He looked at the wedding ring beside it. He had not expected her to take it off. That was the thought that kept returning, cutting through everything else, with a persistence that irritated him, because it also frightened him. He had said those words, and he had said them the way a man says something he does not entirely mean but uses as a weapon, because it is available and because some part of him had calculated that it would produce retreat, not departure. He had been wrong about that calculation. He had been badly, fundamentally wrong, and the evidence of it was sitting in a small gold circle on his dining room table, while the woman who had worn it for 7 years rode away into the March dark. He went to find Margaret. The housekeeper was in the kitchen, moving things around in the methodical, deliberate way she did when she was angry and needed to do something with her hands. She had worked in this house for 19 years. She had served his mother. She had no particular obligation to like Arthur Remington. And in this moment, standing at the kitchen work table with her back very straight, she did not bother to pretend she did. Where did she go? Arthur asked. Margaret did not turn around. I couldn't say, sir, Margaret. She did not tell me her destination. A pause. She did not need to. Arthur stood in the kitchen doorway. The fire in the hearth had burned low. The supper pots had been cleaned and hung. Everything in the kitchen was in perfect order, the kind of order that existed, because someone had spent years making it so, invisibly, without acknowledgement. When did she start packing that trunk? He asked. Margaret was quiet for a moment. Then she turned around, and she looked at him with the steady, weathered expression of a woman who has seen many things in 19 years and has developed opinions about most of them. Mrs. Remington has kept that trunk packed, she said, for the better part of 3 years. Arthur stared at her. Margaret held his gaze without flinching. I imagine she hoped she would never need it. But she was not a woman who left herself without options. She turned back to the work table. Will there be anything else tonight, sir? There was nothing else. He walked back through the house alone. And the house felt different already, not empty exactly. Not yet. But altered. Like a clock that is still ticking, but has lost something essential in its mechanism. The rhythm was wrong. The sound was there, but the sense of it was gone. He did not sleep that night. By morning, he had convinced himself she would be back within the week. He was wrong about that too. March turned to April without a word from Clara. Arthur sent Thomas to inquire discreetly at the Aldridge family property, a modest farm on the eastern side of Hanover County, where Clara's older brother William had managed what remained of the family's reduced circumstances since their father's death. Thomas came back with a short report. Mrs. Remington had arrived, was settled, and was not, in the boy's careful phrasing, in a state of distress. Not in distress. The phrase lodged in Arthur's chest like a splinter. He had expected distress. He had expected, and this was the part he could not examine too closely in the light of day, that within a week, perhaps two, Clara would send a letter. Careful, measured, quietly asking to discuss the situation. That was what she had always done. Every disagreement they had ever had, Clara had been the one to circle back, to find the opening, to apply the steady, patient pressure that smoothed the rough edges between them. She had always been the one to reach across the silence first. The silence this time had no reaching in it. April deepened, and the tobacco seedlings needed attention, and the estate proceeded to demonstrate, with the relentless logic of a household that has lost its center of gravity, exactly what Clara Aldridge Remington had actually been doing for 7 years. It began with small things. The household accounts for the first week of April were submitted to Arthur by the new woman he had engaged, a Mrs. Farrow, the widow of a merchant from Fredericksburg, competent and pleasant, and wholly unequipped for the particular complexity of Remington Hall. The accounts were not wrong, exactly, but they were imprecise in ways that Clara's accounts had never been. Numbers rounded rather than exact. Categories that Clara had maintained with surgical specificity blurred together into general headings that told Arthur nothing useful. He sent the accounts back for correction. Mrs. Farrow corrected what she could and returned them looking largely the same. Then the problem with the Hendricks family came back. John Hendricks's arm had healed, but in the weeks of his recovery, 2 of his tenant neighbors had taken on his plot's workload as a temporary arrangement, an arrangement Clara had apparently negotiated verbally, with the understanding that the Remington household would provide certain provisions to those families in exchange. No one had written this down. Clara had carried it in her head, the way she had apparently carried a great many things, and when Mrs. Farrow arrived with no knowledge of it, the arrangement collapsed, and the 2 neighboring tenants felt, quite reasonably, that they had not been compensated for weeks of extra labor, and they went to speak to Arthur about it directly. Arthur did not know about the arrangement. The conversation that followed was uncomfortable. He paid the men. He paid them fairly. He was not an unreasonable man, he told himself. He had never been an unreasonable man, but the episode left a residue of discomfort that he could not quite shake. Clara had known. Clara had made arrangements he hadn't known about, had built a network of small understandings with the tenants and workers and tradespeople that kept the estate moving smoothly, and he had known none of it because he had never thought to ask. May arrived. The Whitfield credit line came due for review. Arthur sat down with his own version of the letter, the one he had been composing and revising since April, working from Clara's folded draft and his own considerably less precise instincts, and he compared the 2 documents side by side. Hers was better. He sent hers. He changed nothing but the signature. Whitfield wrote back within a fortnight, with terms that were, all things considered, generous. Arthur read the reply twice, and then he sat for a long time at the desk in the study, with the faint pipe smoke smell in the curtains and the survey books on the shelves, and he tried to remember the last time he had thanked Clara for something she had done. He could not remember. That was the moment, not the empty dining table, not the wedding ring on the tablecloth, not the packed trunk or the wheel tracks in the mud. That was the moment Arthur Remington understood that he was in very serious trouble of a kind that money could not address. He rode to the Aldridge farm on a Tuesday in late May, without sending word ahead. He told himself this was practical. A letter would give her time to arrange a formal to position herself to meet him on prepared ground. He wanted to see her as she actually was, to know what she had made of herself in 2 months without him. He wanted the information. He had always been a man who wanted accurate information. He arrived at the Aldridge farm just after mid-morning. He had been to the property twice before, in the years before his marriage, when Clara's father was still alive and the Aldridges were still maintaining something of their former position. The farmhouse was modest but well kept, set back from the road behind old oak trees, the land around it showing the careful tending of people who did not have much and could not afford to waste what they had. What he had not expected was the noise. Children's voices, 5 or 6 of them, at least, coming from behind the house. He dismounted and handed his horse's reins to the young man who came around from the stable, and he followed the sound. Clara was in the side yard. She had a piece of chalk and a flat piece of dark painted board propped against the fence rail, and she was writing letters on it with the chalk, while 4 children watched with the focused intensity of people encountering something important for the first time. A 5th child, very small, sat in the grass nearby with a piece of chalk of its own, drawing something on a flat stone with absolute concentration. Clara was speaking when Arthur came around the corner of the house, and she did not see him immediately. The letter A, she was saying, her voice carrying the particular warmth of a teacher who actually enjoys the work. Say it with me. The children said it. Good. Now, Eleanor, why are you looking at the ground? The letter is up here. The girl named Eleanor looked up, grinned without apology, and said, because there's a beetle, Miss Clara. There will always be beetles, Clara said, with a patience that contained genuine amusement. There will not always be lessons. Look up. Eleanor looked up. Arthur watched Clara, wrote the letter on the board. The children copied it on their slates. She moved among them with easy confidence, correcting grips, offering encouragement, pulling the smallest child's attention back from the beetle with a gentleness that was not performed. She had not yet looked toward the gate where he was standing. Then she did. He watched the moment she registered him the brief. Absolute stillness that passed through her body, the way she held it for exactly 2 seconds, and then let it go. Her face did not change in any way that the children would have noticed. She said something quiet to the oldest of the children, handed him the chalk, and walked toward the gate. She stopped 6 feet from him. She was wearing a plain dark dress, nothing like the careful clothes of Remington Hall. Her hair was not elaborately dressed. She looked well. She looked, Arthur realized, with a sensation he could not immediately name, more rested than he had ever seen her. Arthur, she said. Clara. He held his hat in both hands because it gave them something to do. The directness of it stopped him cold. For the entirety of their marriage, Clara had never spoken to him quite like that. With that particular economy. No softening preamble, no careful diplomatic opening. Just the question, flat and clear and waiting. I came to see how you were, he said. You've seen I wanted to talk. You had considerable time to talk, she replied. You chose other things to do with it. One of the children called something from the yard. Claire held up one finger, wait, and the child subsided. She looked back at Arthur. He said, the estate needs. No, the word was quiet but absolute. You do not come to my brother's farm after 2 months to tell me what the estate needs. You can write that in a letter. That is not why I came. Then tell me why you came. He looked at her. She was watching him with an expression he did not recognize, not cold, not angry, not the careful composure she had always maintained in conflict. Something more settled than that, something that had stopped bracing for impact. I read the Whitfield letter, he said. I sent it. She said nothing. The terms were favorable. Whitfield extended the credit through September. He stopped, started again. I spoke with the Hendricks tenants about the arrangement you had made. I wasn't aware of it. I know you weren't aware of it. I paid them what they were owed. Good. She said it without warmth or accusation. Simply as a statement of fact, acknowledged and put away. Clara, he took a half step forward. I need you to come back. Something moved across her face, swift and complex, gone before he could read it fully. You need me to come back, she repeated. The estate. I told you not to talk to me about the estate. I'm talking about us. Are you? It was not a question the way she said it. It was something more careful, something that was deciding whether to believe him. Because 3 months ago, you told me you could find another wife. You said it calmly, Arthur. You said you'd discuss replacing a piece of furniture. And I've spent these weeks asking myself how many times before that moment had you thought it, and simply not said it out loud. He had no answer to that. The silence stretched. A robin landed on the fence rail between them, regarded both of them with bright indifference, and flew away. I was wrong to say it, Arthur said. I didn't mean it the way it sounded. How did you mean it? Another silence. I don't know, he admitted. And the admission cost him something. He could feel the cost of it in his chest. That, Clara said quietly, is the honest answer. And I will give you credit for it. She folded her hands in front of her, a gesture he recognized. Had seen 1,000 times across the table. Across the desk. Across the length of rooms they had shared. But it is not enough. You came here today because the estate is harder without me. I know that. I could see it in your face before you said a word. And I'm telling you now, I will not go back to Remington Hall to be useful. I was useful for 7 years, and you thought it was duty. I will not mistake usefulness for value again. Arthur stood with his hat in both hands and felt, for possibly the first time in his adult life, the precise dimensions of a mistake he could not purchase his way out of. Then what would it take, he asked. Clara looked at him for a long moment. That is the question, she said. And I don't think you know the answer to it yet. I'm not sure I do either. She glanced back at the children. I have a lesson to finish, Clara. Write to me, she said. If you have things to say, write them. I'll read what you write. She turned and walked back to the children, and she took the chalk from the oldest boy, and she did not look back at Arthur again. He stood at the fence for a moment longer. Then he put on his hat, walked back to his horse, and rode home through the spring afternoontism, with something sitting in the center of his chest that he did not have a name for yet, and would spend the next several months learning to call by its true one. He wrote. He was not a man accustomed to writing letters of a personal nature. Business correspondence was a language he spoke well, but this was a different instrument entirely, and he handled it with the awkwardness of someone learning to use an unfamiliar hand. The first letter was 3 sentences long. It said he hoped she was well, that the spring planting was a proceeding, and that he had seen to the Morrison boundary matter using the survey evidence she had found. He stared at it for a long time after he wrote it. Then he added a 4th sentence. He had not intended to write it, but it arrived on the page with the quiet persistence of something true. I did not acknowledge, at the time, that the solution was yours. I should have. Clara's reply came 10 days later. It was also short. She thanked him for the acknowledgement. She asked whether Cassius Webb had addressed the fence repair on the western boundary before the summer grazing started. She asked nothing personal. He wrote back about the fence. And then, because she had not asked, and perhaps because of that, he wrote a second paragraph about the day he had ridden home from the Aldridge farm in May, and the way the estate had looked to him when he came up the drive, and how he had understood, seeing it from the road, that he had confused the appearance of a thing with its substance for longer than he could account for. He was not sure he was saying it correctly. He sent it anyway. Her reply to that letter took 3 days instead of 10. She wrote, "You were not wrong about the appearance. The house is beautiful, it always was, but a house runs on something you cannot see from the road." He read that sentence 5 times before he replied. June burned into a hot July, and the tobacco grew, and the estate managed itself off the lurching imprecision of a body operating without its most essential functions. Mrs. Farrow did her best, and it was not enough, and Arthur compensated by doing more himself, more than he had done in years, possibly more than he had done since before his marriage. He sat with the ledgers in the evenings the way Clara had always sat with them. He read them carefully and found, in the careful reading, a new comprehension of what they contained and what they revealed, and also a new respect for the woman who had maintained them with such unmarked, unrewarded precision. He fired 2 suppliers in July who had been overcharging on the household accounts, a fact Clara had apparently noted in her own ledger, in a column marked simply "Query," that he had never thought to examine. He paid the Hendricks family a seasonal bonus. He did not announce it. He had Thomas deliver the envelope. He found a notation Clara had made in the wage records regarding the two laborers who had left for the green farm, a note that said, in her clear, precise hand, "These men left because we did not meet the green offer. If we lose more by harvest, we will need to reconsider the wage structure entirely." The note was dated February, 6 weeks before she left. He had never seen it. He implemented the wage increase in August. He did not tell anyone it was her idea. 3 weeks later, he added a postscript to his letter for that week. And the postscript said, "I found your wage notation in the records. I should have found it 7 months ago. I implemented what you recommended. It was the right decision." And then he stopped, and he looked at what he had written, and he added one more line. "I am finding a great many things you left for me to find. I don't know yet whether you left them deliberately or whether I simply never looked. I suspect the answer reflects worse on me than on you." He sent that one without rereading it. Her reply came in 2 days. "The fastest yet," she wrote. "Some of them I left deliberately. I won't pretend otherwise. I always hoped you would look. I told myself, if he looks, maybe there is still something here that can be saved. I stopped hoping that by last winter. But I did not stop leaving the notation." Arthur sat with that letter in the study for the better part of an evening. The fire was low. The house was quiet around him, the particular quiet of a house that is running, that is functional, but that has lost some essential warmth it cannot generate on its own. He thought about a woman who had spent years leaving evidence of her competence in margins and notation columns, hoping a man would look. A man who had the evidence in front of him every day and called it duty and never once looked. He wrote back that night. He wrote more than he had written in any previous letter. He did not plan what he was going to say, and he did not revise it. He wrote about his father, and the way his father had managed his mother, not cruelly, not with intention, but with the same comfortable assumption of primacy that Arthur had inherited along with the estate deed and the silver inkwell and the absolute certainty that a man of property was the architect of his own world and everything in it. He wrote about the difference between a wife and a partner, and how he had understood those words to mean the thing for the whole of his adult life, and how Clara's absence had demonstrated, with a clarity he could not argue with, that they did not. He wrote, "I am not certain I know how to be the second thing. But I am certain that the first thing, the thing I was, cost me the only woman I have ever known who was entirely honest with me. And I would rather learn an uncomfortable skill than continue being comfortable in a way that cost everyone around me something they should not have to pay." He sealed the letter. He sat alone in the study while the fire burned down, somewhere on the Aldridge farm in Hanover County, 11 miles from where he sat. A woman who had managed this estate for 7 years without credit or acknowledgement was living a smaller and quieter life that had, by every report that reached him, more joy in it than the large and formal life she had left. That was the fact that kept him awake. Not the estate. Not the accounts. Not the Morrison boundary, or the Whitfield credit line, or the wage records, or any of the 100 practical problems he had spent the summer learning to manage without her. The fact that she was happier. The fact that she had been waiting for years for something he had never thought to offer. And the question he could not stop turning over in the long, quiet evenings of that summer, but he did not yet know whether he had the capacity to answer, was whether a man could teach himself, at 38 years old, to give something he had never understood he was withholding. He didn't know. But he kept writing, and she kept writing back. And the letters, week by week, were getting longer. The letters had become the most honest thing in Arthur Remington's life. That was not a small admission for a man who had built his identity on the certainty that he was always the most capable person in any room he entered. But by September of 1814, with the tobacco harvest coming in slower than expected and the Whitfield credit line holding by the narrowest of margins, Arthur had developed the habit of writing to Clara in the evenings with a candor he had never managed face to face. Something about the distance made it possible. Something about the page, the way it held words without flinching, without the particular expression Clara used to get when he said, and something revealed more about him than he intended. She had that expression often, he understood now. He had called it stubbornness. He had been wrong about that too. Her letters came twice weekly by late summer, and he read them at the desk in the study. In the same chair where she had sat on the night she found the Richmond investment documents. In the same room where she had managed his household with a competence he had classified as obligation. The letters were direct. Practical when they needed to be, she had opinions about the harvest timing, about Webb's decision to rotate the eastern plots, about the wage structure he had implemented. And her opinions were correct often enough that he had stopped being surprised by it. But they were also, increasingly, something else. They were honest in the way that people are honest when they have stopped trying to preserve something and have started trying to understand it instead. She wrote, in the letter that arrived the third week of September, "I have been thinking about something you wrote last month. About your father. I want to ask you a question, and I want you to answer it honestly, not diplomatically. Did you ever see your father thank your mother for anything she did for that house?" Arthur sat with that question for 2 days before he answered. He wrote back, "No, I did not. I saw him acknowledge her in company, her appearance, her social grace, the quality of her table. But those were performances. They were compliments to his own choosing her. They were not thanks." He paused, added, "I understand now why I am writing this." "I will not pretend I don't." Her reply was 4 sentences. The last one read, "That is the most self-aware thing you have ever said to me in 7 years of marriage and 2 years of correspondence. I want you to sit with that for a while before you write back." He did. He sat with it for 10 days. The situation in Culpeper County arrived and complicated everything. The news came through Thomas, who had it from the postmaster, who had it from a merchant traveling south from Culpeper. George Aldridge, Clara's younger brother, not William the farmer, but George, the one who had been managing the remnants of the Aldridge family's business interests in Fredericksburg, had made a catastrophic error. He had co-signed a note for a business associate, a man named Prentice, and Prentice had defaulted. The note was for $4,000. George Aldridge did not have $4,000. He did not have 400. The debt had rolled to a Richmond creditor named Caulfield, and Caulfield was not the patient sort. Arthur found out about all of this before Clara did. Because the information traveled through the merchant and business channels that Clara no longer had access to in her reduced circumstances. And because William Aldridge, steady, careful, protective William, was in the position of knowing about the Prentice collapse and not yet knowing how to tell his sister. Arthur knew within 48 hours. He sat with the information for 1 full day. He had the resources to address the Caulfield debt. Not easily. The estate was not in the position it would have been a year ago, before he'd understood the true scope of the Richmond investment losses, but he could do it. He had rebuilt enough through the summer's careful management. He could go to Caulfield directly, settle the note, and buy George Aldridge time to make arrangements. The question was whether to tell Clara first or simply do it. This was the question that kept him at the desk past midnight, turning it over with the kind of careful attention he had spent a summer learning to apply to things he had previously dismissed. If he simply did it, settled the debt without telling her, it would look like generosity. It would also look like the old pattern. A man making decisions in the dark, handling things without consultation, acting on behalf of people who had not asked him to act and had not been given the choice. He wrote to Clara that night. He wrote the full situation as he understood. He wrote that he had the means to address it and was willing to do so, and that he wanted to ask, not to inform, but to ask how she would like him to proceed. Whether she wanted him to proceed at all. He sent the letter by express messenger. Her reply came back in less than 24 hours. "Don't touch it yet. I need to speak to George myself. Give me 4 days." He gave her 4 days. On the 4th day, a carriage came up the main drive of Remington Hall, and Clara Aldridge Remington stepped out of it. And Arthur Remington, who had been in the study trying to read a supply ledger for the 3rd time without retaining any of it, heard the wheels on the drive and was at the front door before Thomas could reach it. She looked the same. She looked different. He was not sure those two things were contradictory. She wore a traveling coat he had not seen before, practical, not fashionable, the kind of thing a woman buys when she is managing her own money without anyone else's taste to consider. Her expression was the one he had come to understand. Over the summer of letters was her working expression, the one that meant she had already thought through 3 problems and was working on the 4th. "George won't take help from me," she said before he could speak. "He says it humiliates him. He's 24 years old and proud, and he's made a terrible mistake, and he cannot see Poole's pride to the practical solution." "Men his age rarely can," Arthur replied. Something shifted in her expression. Not warmth exactly, but a reaction of unexpected accuracy. I need to understand the full scope of the Caulfield note before anything else, she said. Do you have that information? He did. He had obtained it over the 4 days she had asked for. He stepped back from the door and she came inside. And they went to the study together. And for the first time in 7 months, Clara Aldridge sat across from him at the desk that had once been as much hers as his. He laid out the Caulfield documents. She read them with the focused efficiency he had always taken for granted. She asked 4 precise questions about Caulfield's standard settlement terms, about whether Prentice had any remaining assets that could be attached, about the timeline for legal action in Richmond courts, and about whether George had told William the full amount yet. Arthur answered all 4. George has not told William, he said on the 4th. William believes the figure is closer to 2,000. George has been managing his brother's understanding of the situation the same way he managed the Prentice note, with optimism and incomplete information. Clara pressed 2 fingers to her forehead briefly. It was a gesture Arthur recognized, not distress exactly, but the particular expression of a person who is not surprised by human foolishness, but still finds it genuinely exasperating. All right, she said, here is what I think should happen. She laid it out cleanly. A structured approach to the Caulfield debt, using Arthur's capital but structured as a business arrangement rather than a family bailout, a 3-year repayment plan for George, with specific terms, that would protect his pride by making it a formal obligation rather than charity. William to be told the true figure immediately, because William was the steady one and could not help if he was working with false information. Prentice's remaining assets to be examined through a Richmond attorney. Clara had an opinion about which one for any possibility of partial recovery. Arthur listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "You worked that out in 4 days." "I worked most of it out on the ride here," she replied. "The outline I had in 20 minutes. The details took longer." "The attorney you're thinking of, is it Hargrove?" Clara looked at him. Something quick crossed her face. "Yes, how did you know?" "Because that's who I would have picked," he said. "And because his name is on the eastern boundary settlement that resolved the Morrison dispute. I had Webb file it with the county last month." A pause. "You used the survey evidence, as I outlined?" "Yes," he held her gaze. "It worked exactly as you said it would." Morrison withdrew the claim within a week of receiving the registry reference. No litigation, no cost. Clara was quiet for a moment. Not the careful silence she used to maintain, the one that was always managing something, always calculating the distance between what she felt and what she could safely say. This was a different kind of quiet. The kind that comes when a person hears something they needed to hear and is deciding what to do with it. "You should have had that survey evidence 7 years ago," she said. "I had it for 7 years," Arthur replied. "I simply didn't look." The words landed in the room with the particular weight of an admission that cannot be called back. Arthur did not look away when he said it. He had practiced over the summer the discipline of not looking away from true things. Clara set down the Caulfield documents. "I'll need to stay 2 days," she said, "to draft the Caulfield arrangement properly and coordinate with William." "You can have the guest room," Arthur said. And then, because he had spent a summer learning to say the thing that was actually true, "or your room. Whichever you prefer." I kept both ready. Clara looked at him steadily. He did not add anything to that. He let it stand as what it was, not a plea, not a negotiation, just a fact. Both rooms ready. Both possibilities held open by a man who had learned slowly and at considerable cost that the act of leaving options open was itself a form of respect. She took the guest room, but she stayed 3 days instead of 2. On the 2nd day, George arrived. He had ridden from Fredericksburg in a state of barely contained mortification, and he walked into the Remington Hall parlor with the tight-shouldered posture of a young man who has prepared himself for humiliation and is determined not to show that he has. He was 24, with Clara's dark eyes and less of her patience, and he looked at Arthur Remington with the particular wariness of a man who knows he owes something to someone he does not entirely trust. Arthur let Clara manage the first part of the conversation. She handled her brother with a combination of bluntness and kindness that Arthur found himself watching with something close to admiration. She did not minimize what George had done. She did not protect him from the full truth of the situation. But she also did not let the humiliation of it crush him into the defensive position where young men become unreachable. You made a mistake, she said to her brother. A serious one. The question now is not whether you made it. The question is what you do about it. I don't need Remington's money, George started. It won't be Remington's money, Clara said. It will be a formal business arrangement with Remington as creditor, documented properly, with repayment terms you will meet because you are an Aldridge and Aldridges pay their debts. She paused. Or you can decline the arrangement and allow Caulfield to take whatever remains of your business assets, which will leave you with nothing, and William with the task of managing the aftermath. That is your choice. George stared at his sister. You're not very gentle about it, he said finally. I'm not gentle about mistakes that can be fixed, Clara replied. I save gentleness for the ones that can't. Something moved through George's face, resistance, and then something more complicated, and then a kind of deflation that was not defeat but acceptance. He looked at Arthur. Arthur met his eyes directly. No interest on the note for the first year, Arthur said. Standard terms after that. Hargrove in Richmond will draw the document. The arrangement stays between the people in this room. George held his gaze for a long moment. Why, he asked. Not combatively, genuinely. Arthur thought about several answers. He chose the true one. Because your sister spent 7 years making this estate worth more than it would have been without her, and I compensated her for it poorly. This is a partial account settlement. The silence that followed that statement was absolute. George looked at Clara. Clara was looking at Arthur with an expression he could not fully read. It was complex, layered, the expression of a person receiving something they had not expected from a direction they had stopped expecting it from. George cleared his throat. Right, he said. Draw the document. That evening, the second evening of Clara's 3-day stay, Arthur found her in the study. She was not at the desk. She was standing at the bookshelf, running her fingers along the spines of the estate archive volumes the way a person does when they are not really looking for a book but need something to do with their hands. The fire was low, the room was warm. George will be all right, she said without turning around. Think so, Arthur replied. He has more sense than he's shown. It was buried under the pride. It runs in the family. He was quiet for a moment. In some members more than others, he said. Clara turned then. She looked at him with that settled, assessing expression, the one that had replaced, over the summer of letters, the careful management of her old face. What you said to George today, she began. I meant it. I know you meant it. That's why I'm asking about it. She moved away from the bookshelf and sat in the chair by the fire. You told him the estate was worth more because of me. You said it in front of him, without being asked, without any calculation. It's true, Arthur. Her voice was careful, not cautious careful, the way a person is careful with something fragile and important. You spent 7 years not saying that, yes, he replied. I did, and I spent 7 years not knowing a great many things that were in front of me every day. He came into the room, took the other chair, not the desk chair, the chair across from hers, the smaller distance. I am not going to tell you that the man I was before March is gone and a different man is sitting here. That is not honest. But I am going to tell you that I understand now what I was doing. Not in the way I did when you were here, and I thought I understood, and I was simply looking at the surface of the thing. I mean, I understand it the way you understand something when you have been without it for long enough to see its true shape. Clara was very still. The fire shifted and settled. What is its true shape? She asked quietly. I treated you like property, he said. Not cruelly, not with intention, but completely. He leaned forward, his forearms on his knees. I inherited this estate and everything on it, and I inherited a way of seeing everything on it, and I put you into that way of seeing without ever asking what you thought of it. Your intelligence, your work, your judgment, I accepted all of it the way I accepted the tobacco harvest, as something that belonged to Remington Hall, as something that was simply there. He stopped. You were not simply there. You were a person making choices every day to stay, and to contribute, and to keep this place from falling apart, and I never once acknowledged that those were choices. I thought they were obligations. Clara's jaw tightened, not in anger. He had learned to read the difference. In the effort of holding something. You wrote something like that, she said. In August I read it 4 times. I've been writing toward it since May, he said. I needed to say it to your face. She looked at him for a long time. I know you mean it, she said at last. And that matters to me. It matters more than I want it to if I'm telling you the truth. She folded her hands in her lap. But Arthur, meaning it is not the same as being it. Knowing what the mistake was is not the same as not making it again. And I am stopped. Steadied herself. I am not the woman who will go back to that house and wait to see which version of you shows up. I did that for 7 years. I am not built for it anymore. The words landed without softening. Arthur did not try to argue with them. He had learned over the summer that arguing with Clara on a point where she was right was a waste of everyone's time. I'm not asking you to come back yet. She looked at him sharply. Yet, he said again, deliberate. I'm asking you to keep writing to me. I'm asking you to let this, whatever this is, whatever we are doing with these letters and this conversation right now, I'm asking you to let it keep going. Clara was quiet. And if I come back, she said slowly. If, what would be different? I don't know yet, he said. That is the honest answer. I know what would be different in me. I know what I understand now that I didn't before. But I don't know what the practical shape of different would look like. I think we would need to build that together. I think he stopped. Tried again. I think I would need to learn it from you. What you need, what makes it worth it. I am not good at asking those questions. But I am trying to become someone who is. The fire had burned down to coals. Outside, the Virginia night was cool and quiet, the harvest fields dark and still. Clara sat for a long time without speaking. Arthur waited. He was learning, slowly the particular, sitting with a silence and not trying to fill it. I found something last week, she said at last. Her voice had shifted, something had come into it, something that was both softer and more serious than what had come before. In William's records. I was helping him sort through some old correspondence from before Father died. Arthur waited. There was a letter, she said, from Father to your father. Written in 1808. 2 years before our marriage. She paused. I need you to hear this, he went still. They planned it, she said. The match between us. They planned it because your father knew about the Richmond investments, not the 1,000. 812 losses. Those came later, but the 1,000. 809 venture. The first one. The one that lost 30,000. Your father wrote to mine that winter, asking for guidance from a man with financial experience because he trusted Father's discretion. Father wrote back with a proposal, not a financial proposal. She looked at him steadily. A marriage proposal, his daughter to your family. In exchange for your father's silence about our own reduced circumstances that were more serious than the county knew. The silence in the room was absolute. Arthur stared at her. My father arranged this marriage, he said slowly, to stabilize your family's social position. And your father agreed to it. Clara replied. Because he needed someone with financial competence in that house. And he knew my father had taught me accounting. He did not want a wife for you, he wanted a manager. He just needed the wife to make the arrangement respectable. Arthur sat back. His mind was moving very fast and arriving at conclusions he did not want. You knew. Not until last week. I had no idea. I believed our match was. She stopped. I believed what a young woman believes, that she had been chosen a beat. I was chosen. Just not for the reasons I thought. The knowledge sat between them like a stone, dropped into still water, and the rings of it moved outward and touched everything. 7 years of marriage. 7 years of Arthur's comfortable certainty that Clara managed the estate because it was her role, because it suited her, because that was what wives of property did. She had been doing exactly what both their fathers had arranged for her to do. And she had done it brilliantly, and neither man had told her why she'd been brought there. Clara. His voice was different, rougher, the voice of a man who has just understood something that changes the shape of a much larger story. I'm sorry, I don't have the words for that yet. I will. I'm not telling you for an apology, she said. I'm telling you because you deserve to know, and because I deserve to say it out loud to someone who was also, it turns out, somewhat deceived. She lifted her chin slightly. We were both managed, Arthur, by men who thought they were solving problems. They solved their problems. They made a considerably larger one for us. He looked at her across the low fire. Does William know about the letter? He found it with me, Clara replied. He's known for a week. He's been working up the courage to tell me whether to tell you. And you decided. I decide my own business, she said quietly. That is something I learned this year. The coals shifted. A log fell softly into ash. Arthur stood not to leave. Clara watched him carefully, and he held up a hand just slightly, in a gesture she had never seen from him before. Something that asked for a moment, a gesture that recognized she might need the assurance. He walked to the desk. He opened the center drawer and took out a single folded document. He walked back and held it out to her. She took it. She unfolded it. It was a legal document, handwritten, witnessed, bearing the seal of the Hanover County Register's office. She read it in the firelight, slowly, and as she read, her expression changed in ways that Arthur watched without interrupting. It was a deed to the small Aldridge farm property where she had been living, the one that had belonged to her family and had been held in encumbrance since her first debt to a county lender in 1806. A debt that had never been fully cleared, a debt that had hung over William's management of the property for 8 years. The deed was clear, the encumbrance had been satisfied. The property was registered free and clear in the name of Clara Aldridge Remington. This was filed in August, she said. You did not tell me. He agreed. I wanted to do it without telling you. Not because I wanted to hide it, because I wanted to do one thing for you that had no negotiation in it. No discussion of terms. No arrangement. He paused. That property belongs to your family. It should have been clear of debt long before now. And I cleared it because it was right, not because it serves me. Clara held the deed. Her hands were steady. Her face was not entirely steady, but she was managing it with the precision she brought to everything. You cannot buy your way back, she said. Her voice was low and careful. That is not what this is. I know that, he said. This is not payment. This is not negotiation. This is a man who did not look for 7 years, finally looking. And finding the things that needed doing and doing them. He held her gaze. You can hate me for the timing. You can tell me I should have done it years ago. Both of those things are true. But I am doing it now. And I will keep doing it. Not to bring you back. Because it is right. Clara was quiet for a very long time. When she spoke, her voice was lower than before, and it carried something in it that was neither forgiveness nor its absence, something that was still deciding. I leave the day after tomorrow, she said. I am not ready to make any decision about anything. I know that too. She looked down at the deed in her hands. Then she folded it carefully and held it against her chest, the way a person holds something they are not sure yet what to do with, but are certain they are not willing to put down. When I'm gone, keep writing. I will, Arthur said. As long as you want letters, I'll write them. She nodded once. She stood. She took the deed with her when she left the room. And Arthur sat alone by the dying fire, in the house that was running but not whole, and felt the particular quality of a hope that has survived long enough to become something more durable than hope, but has not yet found its name. She left on a Thursday morning, and Arthur stood at the front door and watched the carriage go down the drive. And this time it was different from March. In March, he had watched from the dining room window, with the certainty that she would come back on her own terms within the week. He had been wrong about that in every possible way. But this time, watching the carriage reach the end of the main drive and turn east toward Hanover County, he felt something different from certainty. He felt the particular quality of a man who has made his case as honestly as he knows how, and has now given the outcome to someone else to decide. It was not comfortable, but he understood. Exactly right. He went back to work. October came in hard and dry, which was good for the late tobacco harvest and difficult for everything else. Arthur threw himself into the estate with a thoroughness that would have surprised the man he had been a year ago. He was in the fields before Webb most mornings. He knew the names of the tenant families now, not just the Hendrickses, but the Porters and the Gaines family and old Amos Rutledge, who had worked the creek bottom land for 20 years, and knew things about the soil that no survey book contained. Arthur sat with Amos one afternoon in early October and asked him questions and listened to the answers, really listened. And came home that evening with 3 pages of notes in his own hand that he filed in the estate archive under a heading that Clara would have recognized immediately. What the land knows that the ledger doesn't. He did not tell her about the notes in his next letter. He almost did. He wrote the sentence, and then looked at it, and understood that he was reaching for approval, and that reaching for approval was the old pattern wearing a new coat. He crossed it out. He told her instead about the Rutledge conversation because it was interesting. Because Amos had said something about the rotation of the Eastern plots that clarified a problem Arthur had been unable to solve through the account books alone, because it was simply true and worth sharing. Her response to that letter was longer than usual. She wrote about the Aldridge farm's own soil management, about what her father had taught her about crop rotation before she was 12 years old, about a particular technique with cover crops that she had always thought might work on the Remington Creek bottom land and had never had the opportunity to suggest because the creek bottom land was Arthur's domain and she had learned not to offer opinions about domains that were not handed to her. He read that paragraph 3 times. Then he wrote back and asked her to tell him everything she knew about cover crops. She wrote back 12 pages. He read all 12. He implemented what she recommended in the sections of the Eastern plot that had gone fallow. He wrote to tell her he had done it, without framing it as a tribute or a peace offering, simply as what it was the right decision applied. November arrived, and with it 2 things that changed everything. The first was a letter from Richmond, not from Hargrove the attorney, not from the Whitfield Bank, not from any of the creditors Arthur had spent the summer carefully managing. This letter came from a man named Calloway, a business associate of the late Reynolds Prentice, George Aldridge's former partner, the one whose default had triggered the Caulfield debt. Calloway had been conducting his own examination of Prentice's affairs, apparently, and I had found something in the process of that examination that he believed Arthur Remington needed to know. Arthur read the letter standing at the front hall table where Thomas had left it. He read it twice. Then he sat down on the hall bench, which was not a thing he had ever done in his life, and he read it a 3rd time. Prentice had not defaulted by accident. According to Calloway's careful documented account, Prentice had been systematically transferring his business assets to a separate holding for approximately 18 months before the collapse. He had known the note would come due. He had known he could not cover it. He had also known, because George Aldridge had told him in a moment of candid friendship, that the Aldridge family's social standing was maintained on a surface that concealed genuine financial fragility, and that Clara Aldridge Remington's marriage to Arthur Remington was the load-bearing wall of that surface. Prentice had calculated, deliberately, that when the note collapsed, the Caulfield debt would fall to George. George would be unable to pay, and the fallout would reach the Remington estate through Clara. Whether Clara was still in residence or not, he had targeted George specifically because George was connected to Clara. And he had done it in the months immediately following the county-wide gossip that had circulated in the spring about the Remington marriage, about Clara's departure, about Arthur's inability to manage the estate properly without her. Gossip that had made the Remington name look vulnerable for the first time in a generation. Prentice had used Clara's departure as the signal to move. Arthur set down the letter. He picked it up again. He thought about Clara, sitting at the guest room fire 2 months ago, telling him about their father's arrangement with the steady voice of a woman who had decided to be honest about a painful thing, because honesty was what the situation required. He thought about her saying we were both managed. He thought about the way she had held the deed against her chest when she left the study. He thought about the fact that someone had looked at Clara Aldridge Remington, a woman managing her own quiet life on her family's farm, teaching children to read, building something small and dignified out of the wreckage of a marriage, and had calculated that she was a useful lever. That her connection to the Remington name, even in its altered state, could be used as a financial tool. The anger that moved through Arthur Remington in that moment was not the controlled managerial displeasure he had always called anger. It was something older and more physical than that, and it moved through him from his chest outward and left his jaw tight and his hands very still on the letter. He wrote to Clara that same evening, not about the full letter, not yet. He needed Hargrove's legal opinion first, and he needed to understand what could be done. But he wrote to tell her that there were developments in the Prentice matter that required her awareness, and that he would be in Hanover County by the end of the week if she was willing to receive him. Her reply came the next morning. Express messenger, she had sent it before dawn. Come Thursday, I'll be here. He arrived Thursday mid-morning to find Clara already at the small table in William's front room, with 3 letters spread before her and an expression that told him she had not waited for his information. You got Calloway's letter, he said. I got my own version of it. She looked up. Hargrove wrote to me directly. He said he thought I had a right to the information independent of any communication through my husband. Her emphasis on the word was neither hostile nor warm, simply precise. The way she was precise about things whose nature she was still determining. He was right, Arthur said. Something passed briefly across her face. She looked back at the letters. Sit down, he sat. Prentice knew about our situation from the spring, she said. William has been going through George's correspondence from last year. George told Prentice about my leaving in April, during what he thought was a private dinner conversation. He was upset on my behalf and spoke more freely than he should have. Prentice filed the information and moved 12 weeks later. I know, Arthur said. Calloway's account is detailed. Hargrove believes there is a recoverable case. Clara set down one of the letters. Fraud possibly. Certainly misrepresentation. Prentice transferred his assets in a manner that Hargrove says is legally challengeable if the intent can be demonstrated. Calloway is willing to testify. Arthur leaned forward. That recovers George's losses, potentially. It also potentially recovers something from the Caulfield settlement which I paid out of Remington Capital. He paused. Not that it changes anything about why I paid it. But if there is a fraud case, then the estate has standing as an injured party, Clara finished. Yes, I worked that out this morning. She looked at him directly. Hargrove wants to proceed. He needs authorization from both of us, because the estate is the injured party and I am still— She stopped. You are still my wife, Arthur said quietly. In the eyes of the law. Yes, the word was careful. In the eyes of the law. The silence between those two sentences and the silence after them were different in quality. Arthur understood the difference. He did not push on it. Tell Hargrove to proceed, he said. Whatever authorization he needs from me, he has it. Clara nodded. She gathered the letters, moved toward the writing desk in the corner and stopped. There's something else, she said. Her back was to him. Something Hargrove mentioned in the letter that was not about the Prentice matter. Arthur waited. There is a man, she said. A Mr. Edward Farley. He's a merchant from Alexandria. He has been attending the Hanover County social gatherings since July. She said it with her chin slightly up, the expression of a woman who has decided to say a thing directly rather than let it arrive sideways. He has expressed interest in my situation. He is aware of my circumstances. He has spoken to William. Arthur's jaw tightened. He kept his expression level through deliberate effort. He spoke to William, he repeated. William told him that any such conversation needed to go through me directly. Which Farley respected. He has been respectful throughout. She paused. I am telling you because you deserve to know. Not because I am asking your permission or your opinion. I understand. Do you? Yes, he said. You are telling me where things stand. You are not asking me to react. She studied him. What is your reaction, she asked. I want to know. The real one, the real one. He had spent a year learning to give those when asked. He took a breath. My reaction, he said slowly, is that the idea of another man looking at you and seeing what I failed to see for 7 years makes me want to ride to Alexandria and do something inadvisable. He held her gaze. And my second reaction, the one I am more proud of, is that you have every right to be seen. You have every right to be chosen by someone who does not have to lose you first to understand your value. If Farley is that man, then he stopped, steadied himself. Then I have no standing to object, only to regret. Clara looked at him for a long measuring moment. He is not that man, she said finally. He is pleasant and he means well and he is nothing like what I need. She turned back to the writing desk. But I wanted you to know he exists. I wanted you to understand that I am not sitting in this county waiting. I am living. I know you are, Arthur said. It is one of the things I respect most about you. She said nothing to that. She sat down at the desk and began writing to Hargrove. Arthur watched her for a moment, the straight back, the efficient hand, the total absorption of a person doing work they are good at, and then he looked away, out the window, and gave her the space of his silence as the only thing he had left to offer that cost him enough to be worth giving. The Prentice fraud case moved through the Richmond courts with a speed that surprised everyone except Hargrove, who had built his reputation on exactly this kind of documentary precision. By December, Calloway had given his testimony. By January, the case against Prentice's estate was established, and the asset transfers were being unwound. Arthur and Clara corresponded through all of it, not just about the legal proceedings, but around them, in the way that people who have established a genuine habit of honesty find themselves being honest about things adjacent to the main subject because they have lost the discipline of withholding. He wrote about the estate, about Cassius Webb's retirement at Christmas and the difficulty of finding a foreman who understood the creek bottom land the way Amos Rutledge did, about a conversation he had with the local minister that left him thinking for a week about the difference between repentance and repair. She wrote about the children she taught, about George, who was managing his affairs with a new sobriety that impressed her and amused her in equal measure, about the Aldridge farm property, her property now, clear and documented, and the small improvements William was helping her make to it, about a book she had found in her father's library that she had been reading in the evenings, a collection of letters between John and Abigail Adams that she found. She wrote, alternately inspiring and devastating. He wrote back, devastating in what way? She wrote, because John Adams understood, at least on paper, that Abigail was his equal. He wrote it down, he told her so, and still the practical arrangements of their life did not reflect it. Because understanding a thing and building a life that matches that understanding are two entirely different endeavors. One requires intelligence, the other requires will. He wrote, and courage. She wrote back, yes, and courage. The Prentice settlement came through in February of 1815. The recovered assets were sufficient to repay Arthur's capital outlay on the Caulfield debt, with a remainder that went to George as partial restitution. Hargrove sent the documents with a note of professional satisfaction that was for a Richmond attorney almost giddy. Arthur received the settlement on a Tuesday. He sent a copy to Clara with no accompanying letter. She wrote back on Thursday. The letter was short. 4 sentences and then a question. She wrote, the estate is in better order than it has been in years. Your letters show a man who is learning to look at what is actually there. George tells me you visited him in Fredericksburg last month and did not mention the settlement case once, which is either restraint or genuine interest in his company. He believes it was genuine, is he right? Arthur wrote back, he is right. He is better company than I expected. He reminds me of you in ways that I suspect he would find embarrassing if I told him. She wrote, tell him anyway. He needs to hear it from someone other than William. He told George the next time he saw him. George was in fact embarrassed. And then he was not. And then he asked Arthur a question that Arthur had not expected from him, in the careful private way of a young man who has been carrying something he has decided to put down. Do you love her? George asked. My sister. Do you actually love her? Not the estate version of her. Arthur was quiet for a moment. They were standing outside the Fredericksburg Merchant Exchange in the cold February air, and the question sat between them without any place to hide. Yes, Arthur said. I have loved her badly, and I have loved her without understanding what love required from me, and I have spent a year learning what I should have known from the beginning. But George looked at him. Then tell her that, he said. Not in a letter. Tell her, while she can see your face. Arthur rode back to Remington Hall that evening, with George Aldridge's words beside him the whole way, sitting in the part of his chest that was not the practical thinking part, the part that had been learning, slowly and with considerable difficulty, to carry things it had spent a lifetime refusing to hold. He arrived at the Aldridge farm on the first Saturday of March, exactly 1 year after Clara had removed her wedding ring and set it on the dining room table. He had not planned the date deliberately. He realized it only when he looked at the calendar on the Thursday before and felt something go quiet inside him. Not grief exactly, but the particular solemn weight of an anniversary that means something. She was in the yard when he arrived. Not teaching, this time the children were not there. She was working with William on something involving the fence line along the north edge of the property, and they were arguing about it in the comfortable, specific way of siblings who have been arguing about the same categories of things since childhood. William saw Arthur's horse first and said something to Clara. She turned. She looked at him for a moment across the yard. Then she said something brief to William, who nodded and took himself off toward the barn with the practiced tact of a man who has been managing the space between other people's business for some time, and she walked to the gate. Arthur. He dismounted. I know I didn't write ahead. No, you didn't. I needed to say something to you that I have not been able to say correctly in letters, he said. And George told me I had to say it to your face. He was right. He usually is when it matters. He gets that from you. Clara was watching him with that expression that settled, assessing one that had replaced, over a year, the careful managed composure of their marriage. She was not helping him. She was not closing the distance or softening what he had to navigate to reach her. She was simply there, present and still, waiting to hear what he had come to say. He had thought about how to say it for 3 weeks. None of his prepared versions felt right, standing in front of her on a March morning with the year between them and everything it had changed. So he said the plain version. I love you, he said. Not the woman who managed my estate, not the woman who saved my family's financial reputation with letters I didn't acknowledge. The woman who taught Amos Rutledge's granddaughter to read because she was there, and the child needed teaching, and Clara Aldridge does not walk past a thing that needs doing. The woman who wrote 12 pages about cover crops because she was finally asked, and she had been waiting 7 years to be asked. The woman who found a letter that dismantled everything she believed about her own marriage and told me about it anyway because she thought I deserved to know. He stopped. I love you badly, and I am learning to love you better, and I will not promise I am finished making mistakes because that promise would be false, and you have earned the truth from me. Clara stood very still. I will promise, he continued, that I will not make the same mistake twice. I will not treat your work as duty. I will not make decisions that belong to both of us in the dark. I will not use the weight of this marriage against you. And I will not, his voice shifted, roughened at the edge. I will not say to you again that you are replaceable. Because I spent a year finding out exactly what cannot be replaced, and it is you. All of you. The parts that are difficult, and the parts that are brilliant, and the parts that were patient with me for 7 years longer than I deserved. The wind moved between them. Clara's eyes were bright. She was not crying. She was doing that thing she did, holding the feeling precisely, managing the form of it without suppressing the substance, because Clara Aldridge had always been able to carry a great deal without letting it spill. I need to ask you something, she said. Ask. Her voice was steady. If I come back to that house, what does it look like? Not what you intend. What it actually looks like day to day. It looks like the estate accounts are managed by both of us, he said. It looks like the decisions about the land and the tenants and the harvest are made with your knowledge alongside mine, not your knowledge serving mine. It looks like your name is on correspondence where your work has shaped the content. It looks like when Cassius Webb's replacement needs hiring, I ask your opinion before I make the offer. He paused. It looks like I ask, and I listen to the answer. Clara was quiet for a moment, and the things I built here. She tilted her chin toward the farm. The children I teach. The arrangement William and I have made about this property. They don't stop, he said. This farm is yours. The teaching is yours. Whatever you have built in this year, I am not asking you to dismantle it to come back. I am asking you to come back alongside it. She looked at him. Something in her face was deciding. He waited. He had learned this year how to wait. I'm not coming back today, she said. His chest tightened. I need 2 more weeks, she continued. Not because I am uncertain. Because I want to walk back into that house as myself. As Clara Aldridge Remington, who chose to return, not Clara Aldridge Remington, who was collected and brought home. 2 weeks, and then I'll come. The distinction was precise and true and completely characteristic of the woman in front of him. And something in Arthur's chest moved in a way that was not tightening, but releasing the slow unknotting of something that had been held too long in one position. 2 weeks, he said. I'll write to let you know which day. He nodded. He put on his hat. He looked at her one long, steady look, the kind that says what words have already said, the kind that holds the weight of a year's worth of letters and one disastrous sentence that had somehow become the beginning of something worth having. She met it without looking away. He mounted and turned his horse toward the road. He had reached the end of the farm lane when he heard her voice behind him, not loud but clear. Arthur. He stopped, turned. She was standing at the gate. The morning light was on her face. The cover crop rotation, she said. In the spring, start with the northern section of the creek bottom. Not the eastern. The eastern needs another season. He looked at her for a moment. Something moved through him that he did not try to name and did not try to contain. Noted, he said, and he rode home. The letter came on a Wednesday. Arthur had been expecting it. Clara had said 2 weeks, and he had been counting the days with a discipline he applied to nothing else in his life, checking the morning correspondence with a casualness he did not feel. 14 days after he rode away from the Aldridge farm, Thomas brought the post to the study, and there it was. Clara's handwriting on the outside, precise and clean the way she wrote everything. He opened it standing at the desk. It was 4 sentences. Saturday, I'll come in the afternoon. Please tell Margaret I'd like the east garden door unlocked. I've always preferred coming in through the back. And start the cover crops on the northern section first. You'll see why by June. He read it twice. He set it down. He picked it up and read it a third time because of the last 2 sentences. Because she was already thinking about June. Because June was a future she was including herself in. And that fact moved through him with a force entirely disproportionate to 2 sentences about cover crops and entirely appropriate to what those 2 sentences actually meant. He told Margaret that afternoon. Margaret received the news with the expression of a woman who has been waiting for something for a long time and has developed in the course of that waiting both patience and strong opinions. She said nothing dramatic. She simply nodded, said Saturday afternoon, and went to find the housekeeper's book, which she opened with the particular purposeful energy of a person who has a great deal to do and no intention of wasting a moment of the time available to do it. By Friday evening, the house was different. Not decorated. Clara would have hated anything that looked like ceremony. And Arthur understood that about her now in a way he had not understood it before, when he had confused her preference for substance over performance with a simple lack of sentiment. The difference was in the things that had been quietly, carefully set right. A vase of early spring flowers on the sideboard, Margaret's doing. The east garden door oiled so it opened without catching. The household account books placed on the study desk, open to the current page, because Clara would want to look at them, and she would not want to have to ask. The fire in the study laid and ready to light. Saturday came gray and cool, the kind of March day that cannot decide whether it is ending winter or beginning spring. Arthur did not pace, because pacing was not a thing he did. But he found himself in the study, then the front hall, then the kitchen, anywhere Margaret was not. Because Margaret had developed, over the course of Saturday morning, the serene efficiency of a woman running a very precise operation and did not need him underfoot. He went to the stables. He checked on the horses which did not need checking. He spoke to the stable hand, whose name was Jeremiah and who was 17 and had the good sense not to ask why Mr. Remington was standing in the stable at 11 in the morning looking at a wall. He went back inside. At 2:30 in the afternoon he heard the carriage on the back lane. He did not go to the east garden door immediately. He stood in the study doorway for a moment and made himself breathe, made himself hold still. Because Clara had said she was coming back as herself, as a woman who had chosen, not as someone collected, and the least he could do was let her come through the door before he was standing on top of it. He heard the door open. He heard Margaret's voice, warm and low, and Clara's response, and then a sound he recognized, the particular sound of a trunk being set on a flagstone floor. He walked down the hall. Clara was standing in the back passage with her traveling coat still on, and her hand resting on the trunk handle, and she was looking around the house with an expression he had not seen before. Not the working expression, not the settled assessment, not the careful management of feeling. Something quieter than all of those. Something that was recognizing a place and finding, in the recognition, something complicated. She looked at him when he appeared in the passage. You oiled the door, she said. It's been catching for 2 years. I know. I put it on the maintenance list in 1812. Something moved in her eyes, brief and wry. It only took you 3 years and a marital crisis. I work at my own pace, he said, and she laughed. It was a small laugh, surprised out of her, the kind that arrives before a person has decided whether to let it, but it was entirely real. And it changed the quality of the air in the passage in a way that Arthur registered in his chest and did not try to analyze. Margaret appeared from the kitchen doorway, looked at the two of them, and said she would bring tea to the study, and then removed herself with the efficiency of a woman who understands when her presence has served its purpose. They went to the study together. Clara took off her traveling coat. She sat in the chair she had always preferred, not the one across from the desk where visitors sat, but the one beside the fire, Angled slightly inward. The one that said I belong in this room, rather than I am here on temporary business. She sat in it the way a person sits in a place they have decided to occupy rather than merely tolerate. Arthur sat across from her. The tea arrived. Neither of them touched it immediately. The account books are current, he said. I left them open on the desk. I saw. She glanced toward the desk. The September entries looked different from the earlier ones. I started keeping them myself in August. She looked back at him. The handwriting. Is the method wrong? The method is fine. She paused. The categorization for the tenant provisions is slightly imprecise. I'll show you how I structured it tonight, if you want. Yes, he said. I want. The simplicity of that exchange, its complete ordinariness, the way it asked nothing of either of them, except attention to a real and present task, settled something in the room that all the letters in the world had not been able to fully settle. This was not correspondence. This was not the careful, considered distance of written words. This was two people in the same room, talking about accounts and categorization and what came next, and meaning. Underneath all of it, something that neither of them needed to say because they were already inside it. The first week was careful, not strained careful, the way people are careful with things they value, with the particular attentiveness of someone who has broken something once and understands now that the breaking was not inevitable but was also not impossible and has adjusted accordingly. Clara reviewed the accounts. She found 4 places where Arthur's system was imprecise, and 3 places where it was, she said with the directness that had always been her most reliable quality, actually better than what she had been doing before. He asked her why, she explained. He asked a follow-up question. She answered it. They spent 2 hours on a Tuesday afternoon rebuilding the tenant provisions ledger together, and at the end of it the ledger was better than it had been under either of them working alone. Which was, Arthur thought, either a very simple lesson or a very profound one, and probably both. She went to the Aldridge farm on Thursday. She took the small carriage herself and came back by supper. And when Arthur asked how William was managing, she told him in full and included 3 details about the north fence repair that had been unresolved since November, and then asked whether Remington Hall had spare lumber that could be sent over on Friday. He had it sent Friday morning, she noticed. She said nothing about it directly. But that evening she poured his tea without being asked, which was a small thing. But Clara did not do small things accidentally. The second week, she hired a girl from the Gaines family to help with the household, a 15-year-old named Ruth who was quick and wanted to learn everything. Clara taught her the account entries first, which Arthur watched from the study doorway one morning with an expression he hoped was not too visible. Ruth was learning estate accounting at 15. Clara had learned it at 11. The pattern was not accidental. Clara was building something quietly, the way she had always built things. But this time she was building it with Arthur's full knowledge and explicit support rather than around his comfortable ignorance. He told her so. They were in the study after supper, the fire going well. The account books closed for the evening, and he said, "You're teaching Ruth to manage accounts." "Yes, because you want her to have options." Clara looked at him steadily. "Because she's intelligent and she's 15 and no one has told her yet that her intelligence is an asset rather than an inconvenience." "I would like to be the person who tells her." "You're good at that," Arthur said. "At what? Seeing what people have that they don't know how to use yet." Clara was quiet for a moment. "I didn't always show you what I saw." "No," he said, "and I didn't make it easy to show me." He met her eyes. "I would like you to show me now. Whatever you see in the estate, in the tenants, in any of it. I want to hear it." She looked at him with that assessing expression, the one that had gotten quieter and less guarded as the weeks progressed. "You'll hear things you don't like," she said. "I expect so. And you won't dismiss them, no." He held her gaze. She nodded once, picked up her book, and proceeded to tell him, over the next 40 minutes, 7 specific observations about the estate's operations that she had been holding since her return, delivered with the precise, practical clarity of someone who had been waiting for the correct conditions to speak and had finally found them. He listened to all 7. He agreed with 5 outright. He pushed back on 1, the question of whether to expand the tenant plot allocations, with a counter-argument based on the creek bottom soil data that Amos Rutledge had given him in October. And Clara listened to the counter-argument with genuine attention and then said, "You're right about the eastern section. I hadn't accounted for Rutledge's rotation data. The western plots are still worth revisiting." He told her to revisit them. She did. The one she had been right about became policy by the following Monday. 3 weeks after Clara's return, the county held its spring assembly in the Hanover Courthouse Hall, and the Remingtons attended together for the first time in over a year. Arthur had not thought carefully enough about what that would mean. The assembly was the primary social gathering of the spring season landowners, merchants, attorneys, the kind of company that constituted the county's memory and its opinion-making apparatus, and which had spent the better part of a year circulating various accounts of the Remington situation with the reliable enthusiasm that prosperous people apply to other people's difficulties. They knew Clara had left. They knew she had been living at the Aldridge farm. They had opinions, some sympathetic to her, some loyal to the Remington name, some simply entertained by the whole business, in the way that bystanders are entertained by things that cost them nothing. Arthur understood this walking in. What he had not fully anticipated was the specific form it would take. It took the form of Mrs. Pauline Croft, who was 58 years old, had been the county's most reliable social authority for 30 years, and who moved through the assembly hall with the confidence of a woman who believes her judgment about people is both accurate and welcome. She reached Clara within 4 minutes of their arrival, which suggested she had been positioned for it. Mrs. Remington. Her smile was warm on the surface and measuring underneath. "What a pleasure to see you in company again. We had wondered, we had quite worried whether you were well." Clara looked at her pleasantly. "I'm very well, thank you. The spring air suits me. And you've come back to the hall, Mrs." Croft's eyes moved briefly to Arthur, then back. "How fortunate." "For me," Clara said. "I came back when it suited me." Mrs. Croft blinked at the precision of that. Arthur watched his wife correct the narrative of her own life in 2 sentences, without raising her voice or departing from politeness, and felt something in him that was adjacent to pride and considerably deeper. "Of course," Mrs. Croft managed. "How is your husband's tobacco crop this season?" Clara asked, pivoting with an ease that left no room for recovery. "I heard there was some difficulty with the Culpeper County soil last summer." Mrs. Croft spent the next 4 minutes discussing tobacco and did not mention Clara's year at the Aldridge farm again. Later, much later, when the assembly was winding down and people were retrieving coats and saying their final evening pleasantries, Arthur found himself standing near the door with James Whitfield, who had come down from his bank offices in a capacity that was nominally social and practically professional. Whitfield was 60, cautious, and had the particular quality of a man who counts things accurately and remembers what he counted. "Your estate is in considerably better order than it was 18 months ago," Whitfield observed. Not a compliment exactly, more an audit note delivered conversationally. "It is," Arthur agreed. "The cover crop rotation on the northern creek bottom section, I heard from Webb's replacement about that." "Unusual approach for this county. Whose idea?" Arthur looked at him. "My wife's," he said. "She's had opinions about the creek bottom land for years. I recently had the intelligence to ask her for them." Whitfield looked across the room to where Clara was speaking with a group that included Hargrove, who had come down from Richmond, and 2 other women whose husbands were Whitfield's clients. Clara was saying something that made Hargrove laugh, a genuine laugh, the kind that lawyers do not manufacture. Whitfield said. "Yes," Arthur said. "She is, you're fortunate she came back." Arthur was quiet for a moment. "She came back on her own terms. I would not call that fortune. I would call it something I had to earn." Whitfield looked at him with the expression of a man who has revised his opinion of another man and is not sure yet where to file the revision. He said, which for Whitfield constituted high praise. On the ride home, Clara was quiet for a time, the comfortable quiet of someone processing a full evening rather than the careful silence of someone managing what they cannot say. "Then Whitfield spoke to you?" "Briefly." "What did he say?" "The estate was in better order." Arthur paused. "Told him the cover crop rotation was your idea." Clara turned to look at him in the dark carriage. "You said that?" "Public." "To James Whitfield?" "Yes." Without being asked. "It was true," he said simply. She looked at him for a long moment. "That," she said finally, "is new." "Yes," he agreed. "It is." She turned back to the window, and he could see the line of her profile against the dark, and something her expression had shifted to in a territory that was neither the old careful management nor the settled assessment of the year apart. Something that was quieter and less defended than either. He did not press it. He had learned, over a year of letters and the 3 weeks since her return, that some of Clara's most important moments were the ones she processed in silence, and that the correct response to those moments was simply to be present for them without demanding anything of them. They rode home through the March night. The twist that changed everything came from the least expected direction. It was Hargrove who brought it, on an afternoon in early April, arriving at Remington Hall with the particular expression of a man who has news that is simultaneously good and complicated, and is not sure which quality will land first. He had both of them in the study, Arthur behind the desk, Clara in her chair beside the fire, before he said what he had come to say. The Prentice estate settlement had concluded. The full asset recovery was complete. The amount recovered exceeded what Hargrove had projected, because Calloway's testimony had been more comprehensive than anticipated, and the Richmond court had ruled broadly on the fraud claim. The Caulfield debt restitution covered Arthur's original outlay entirely. George's losses were substantially restored, but that was not the complicated part. The complicated part was a document that Hargrove set on the desk between them. It was a deed, not the Aldridge farm deed, which Arthur had cleared months ago. This was different. It was a deed to a parcel of property that had belonged to the original Prentice holdings, 42 acres of bottom land along the Rappahannock River. Good agricultural property, with a small house on it that had been used as a manager's residence. The court determined, Hargrove said carefully, that because Mrs. Remington's departure from Remington Hall was a direct contributing factor to Prentice's opportunity, he identified the marriage instability as his entry point. The injured party calculation includes Mrs. Remington personally, not solely the estate. Clara had gone very still. What does that mean? Arthur asked. It means, Hargrove said, that the court has awarded 42 acres on the Rappahannock to Mrs. Clara Aldridge Remington, independently, not as part of the estate. He paused. It is hers outright. Under Virginia law, with the specific court notation, it cannot revert to a husband's control. It is the first time I have seen a ruling like it in 20 years of practice. The room was silent. Clara looked at the deed. She did not reach for it immediately. She looked at it the way a person looks at something they have not dared to want, and have never quite allowed themselves to picture. Arthur looked at her. He looked at the deed. He looked at Hargrove. Is this final? He asked. Fully executed and registered, Hargrove confirmed. Yesterday. Arthur nodded once. He stood. He picked up the deed and walked around the desk and set it in front of Clara, not handed it to her. Set it directly in her space, with a deliberateness that was itself a statement. 42 acres, he said, on the Rappahannock. Clara looked to yours, he said, not this estate. Not because of this marriage, because someone tried to use you as a lever, and the law decided that was wrong and gave you something in recompense. That belongs to you the same way the Aldridge farm belongs to you, as something that is Clara Aldridge's, not anyone else's. She held his gaze. Aren't you? She stopped, tried again. Most men would find. I am not most men, Arthur said. I am a man who spent a year learning, very specifically, that your independence is not a threat to me. It is one of the things I love about you. He stepped back. What you do with that property is your business. Whether you farm it, lease it, give it to William, whatever you decide. I have no opinion that was not asked for. Clara looked at the deed for a long moment. Then she picked it up. She held it the way she had held the Aldridge farm deed, against her chest, both hands flat over the paper, and she breathed. Hargrove, who was a perceptive man, found a reason to examine something in his document case with great concentration. When she looked up, her eyes were bright, but her voice was steady. I'm going to lease it, she said, to a family. There's a tenant family in this county, the Porters. They've been working rented land for 12 years, and they have 4 sons who know farming the way some men know law. They deserve ground under their feet. She paused. And I'll set the lease terms myself. Yes, Arthur said. Low ones the first 3 years. Yes, you might disagree with that on revenue grounds. I disagree with it on revenue grounds, he said calmly. And you'll do it anyway. Because it's the right decision for the Porters, and you know it, and I know it, and the revenue difference is something this estate can absorb. Clara looked at him. Something opened in her expression, the last defended thing, the thing that had been waiting through a year of letters and 3 weeks of careful return and one spring assembly, and a conversation in a carriage on a March night. All of it waiting for precisely this moment. This proof not of love declared, but of love practiced, love that gives ground on a revenue argument, without being asked, because the person who knows better is standing right there. She said quietly, "Yes, give me your hand." He held out his hand. She reached into the pocket of her dress and placed something in his palm. He looked down, her wedding ring. He had not seen it since the night she set it on the dining room table, beside the folded Whitfield letter, 14 months ago. He had assumed she had taken it. He had not asked. It was he had understood, not a thing he had the standing to ask about. He looked at it in his palm. Then he looked at her. "I've been carrying it since March," she said. "Since you came to the farm." Her voice was steady and direct, the way she was direct about everything that mattered. "I wasn't ready to put it back then. I needed to come home first. I needed to see whether the home I came back to was the one worth putting it back for." "Is it?" "It is." He took her left hand. He placed the ring on her finger. His hands were not entirely steady, and he did not try to pretend they were. Clara looked at the ring for a moment. Then she looked at him, and what was in her expression was not the soft sentiment of romance novels, or the performed emotion of women who have been told what they are supposed to feel when their husbands return to them. It was something real, and earned the expression of a woman who has walked away from a burning thing, rebuilt herself in the open air, and chosen, with her eyes open and her property in her own name and her full intelligence intact, to come back. Not because she needed to, because she wanted to. There was, Arthur Remington understood in that moment, no more significant difference in the world. June came, and with it the early tobacco and the cover crops on the northern creek bottom land, and Clara had been right about all of it. The Porter family moved onto the Rappahannock property on the 1st of June, and Clara rode out to meet them herself. And when she came home that evening, she was tired in the good way, the way of a person who has done something real, and felt its weight, and does not regret it. Arthur was waiting with supper on the table and the accounts on the desk, and Ruth, the Gaines girl, hovering near the kitchen, with the look of someone who has learned enough to be proud of it, and enough more to know how much further there is to go. "How are the Porters?" Arthur asked. "Good," Clara said. She sat down across from him at the dining table, the same chairs, the room that had been silent after the worst sentence he had ever spoken. "The eldest son has a natural instinct for the soil. I've already told him about the rotation schedule. He asked better questions than most men twice his age. He can come speak to Rutledge," Arthur said. "Amos would talk about that land to anyone willing to listen. I already told him so." She picked up her fork. "He'll be here Tuesday." Arthur looked at her across the table. She was looking at her plate, already managing the next thing, already moving through the landscape of what needed doing with the competence that had always been there, that had never needed him to grant it anything except what it had always deserved. He said, "The Whitfield Bank's spring report came today. I saw it on the desk. The estate is rated stable for the first time since 1811. Stable." She repeated his word. Something moved across her face, satisfaction, earned and specific. "We should revisit the eastern plot rotation before harvest," she said. "I was going to propose the same thing. Thursday?" "Thursday." She nodded and returned to supper. And the room that had once held the most damaging silence of their shared life held instead the sound of two people eating together, ordinary, present, unhurried, with the particular quality of those who have fought hard for an ordinary thing and know its worth precisely because they once came so close to losing it. Later that evening, Arthur found Clara at the study desk with the ledgers, Ruth beside her following the column entries with a careful finger, while Clara talked her through the harvest projection method. He watched them from the doorway for a moment, the woman who had always seen what people had that they didn't know how to use, and the girl who was learning to use it, and he thought about his father, and his father's way of seeing, and the inheritance of comfortable assumption that passes from man to son like land and silver,
unquestioned.
because it has never been questioned. He thought about the letter his father had written to Thomas Aldridge in the winter of 1808, The letter that had set all of it in motion. The letter that had sent a young woman into a house as a function rather than a person. He thought about the function that had become, in spite of everything, something neither father had planned for, and neither man had deserved a marriage between two people who had nearly lost each other to the weight of what they had never said and had spent a year learning to say instead. He stepped back from the doorway and let them work. Later still, when Ruth had gone home and the fire had burned to coals and the ledgers were closed, Clafrau found standing at the study window with his back to the room. She came and stood beside him. They did not speak for a moment. I was thinking about the letter, he said. Our fathers. The derangement, I think about it sometimes, she replied. Less than I used to. They thought they were solving problems, he said. They were, she said, their problems, they simply didn't account for ours. He was quiet for a moment. We solved ours ourselves, he said. Eventually, she allowed, at considerable cost. Yes, she looked at him steadily. But we solved them. And Arthur, that is the part that matters. Not how long it took. Not how badly we came to it. That we came to it. He looked at her. She was right. She was almost always right. And he had spent years being irritated by it. And now he understood that the correct response to a person who is almost always right is not irritation but gratitude. And he felt that now without qualification. Clara Aldridge, he said. Remington, she added firmly. Clara Aldridge Remington, he said. I told you once that I could find another wife. Her expression did not change, but something in her eyes sharpened with recognition. I remember. I was the most wrong I have ever been, he said. In my entire life. Clara looked at him. She said you were. There was never another you, he said. There was never going to be. I simply had not yet done the work of understanding what I had. She held his gaze without softening it, without performing acceptance she did not feel. This was not forgiveness handed over easily. It was something more durable than that. It was a woman who had chosen, with everything she now knew and everything she now owned and every option she now held in her own name, to stand beside this man anyway. Not because she had to. Not because the world had arranged things so that she must. But because she had looked at the full truth of what they were and had decided it was worth choosing. Then understand it now, she said, and keep understanding it. Every day, the fire had gone to coals behind them. The house was quiet around them, the house that had been kept by a woman for 7 years, without credit, that had nearly been lost, that had been rebuilt by two people learning, slowly and at great cost, that a home is not a property but a practice. Clara Aldridge Remington had not come back to Remington Hall because she had nowhere else to go. She had 42 acres on the Rappahannock, and a farm in Hanover County, and the respect of a Richmond court one, and a 15-year-old girl learning estate accounting, because a woman had decided that intelligence should not be wasted. She had come back because she had chosen to. And that choice freely made, eyes open, with the full weight of everything she knew, and everything she had survived, was the only thing Arthur Remington had ever been given, that he had not been able to simply inherit. It was also the only thing he had ever been given that truly mattered. He had not deserved it. He had earned it. That difference was the whole of the story, and it was enough.